back, and now we're going to talk about the Great Depression and World War II. Actually, we're going to talk a little bit more about World War II and the forces that led up to it than the Great Depression. However, we must keep in mind that the Great Depression exacerbated existing conditions in ways that were perhaps predictable, but also completely avoidable. Before we do that, I want to get into some class questions, and I want you to think about these. Now, what is more important to a body politic, that is, the voting people of any given country? What is more important? Is social stability or political freedom more important? Why I ask this question is because in Western liberal democracies, social stability is not a given. However, political freedoms typically are. For example, the ability to associate with anybody, to speak your mind and not be censored by the government, to assemble and protest grievances. These are inherently destabilizing for a society because if you speak out against a policy, if you demonstrate against a law or a war, you are inherently disrupting the society. You are not making it smooth. By the other standard, if you want social stability, which typically doesn't necessarily come hand in hand with liberal democracies, then you must unfortunately give up some political freedoms. For example, if you want a socially stable economy, then the ability for people to, say, protest monopolies or to defy laws, you have to crack down on those very strongly. A perfect example is what happened in India in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. The flouting of those laws to assemble, the Amritsar massacre that we talked about last week was the flouting of a law. That law was intended to promote social stability. But when you have thousands of people gathering and even peacefully protesting and peacefully speaking out and peacefully disrupting that law, you by necessity have to crack down on them. Did you have to crack down quite so hard that you murdered dozens of people? Probably not, but you're really skating the line there. And then also, what's more important to a body politic? Economic stability or rights? Often they are seen as hand in hand. It is actually a very delicate balance to balance individual rights with economic stability. This is a problem that a lot of Western liberalized countries had to deal with in the 1920s and 30s. Some chose one path and some chose a different path. Much like the social stability versus political freedom argument, it is also a delicate balancing act that sometimes we don't quite get right. Now, I want you to think about why you answered the way that you did. And I want you to write down some thoughts that occurred to you when you were deciding that. Did you go with a gut instinct? Did you, oh, well, political stability is obviously more important. Well, why? Why did you do that? And the reason why we want to examine that is because this period in world history offers us a unique mirror to the human psyche and to the human reaction. A lot of us like to think that we wouldn't comply with Nazi propaganda. We wouldn't comply with the social pressure from fascism. We wouldn't comply with harsh measures. But historically speaking, it is a very rare individual who can do that. And often it's a person or people who have very strong beliefs in right and versus wrong, or they have very strong moral beliefs that have been examined and really you're comfortable with. If you're making it as a kind of gut instinct, examine that. Figure out why, because that's important. As we've mentioned before, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure likes to rhyme. and we will see a lot of rhyming themes as we move forward. Speaking of rhyming themes, let's talk about some terms. So first off, totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is politically agnostic. What does that mean? Well, it's not the domain of far right governments, and it's not the exclusive domain of far left governments. You can have leftist totalitarian regimes, absolutely. A good example of that would be Stalin's regime or Pol Pot's or Mao Zedong's. You can also have far right totalitarian regimes. And what does totalitarian mean? Well, it means that a political party gets into power and skews the system to ensure that they maintain power above all. Winning matters, period. And often party loyalty is mistaken for national loyalty. A good example of this would be the National Socialist National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazis. Later on, towards the end of the 1930s, the beginning of the 1940s, uh, participation in the Nazi Party is increasingly important to operate within German society. So you have a lot of people who otherwise would never have joined the Nazi Party who are forced to join the Nazi Party because they want to work. They want to be able to provide food for their family. They want to be able to put a roof over their family's head. They also don't want to be seen as an enemy of the state. Loyalty to the party means loyalty to the state. That's a totalitarian regime. Can that happen in other nations? Yes. Can that happen in other time periods? Absolutely. Any one political party that skews, say, voting rights or powers or term limits or whatever can skew towards totalitarianism, because then the party is only interested in maintaining its own grip over power, and the state and the people come second or third or fourth or whatever. That segues into fascism, since we've kind of been touching on that already. Fascism is an ultra right-wing totalitarian regime. Fascism is often mistakenly conflated with socialism because of the nature of the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party. They are about as socialist as I am a dish of ice cream. That's it. They start off as a socialist party, absolutely. We'll get into how that changes, what kind of changes take place, but the takeaway is that by the time we get the Nazi party in power in Germany in the 1930s, um, it is an ultra right-wing, ultra conservative, anti-liberal party that is a totalitarian party. It is often referred to as a corporatist party. That is, that the corporations, the German corporations, and the German government often work in cahoots, making laws that restrict the rights of workers and everyday Germans. In return, the companies have a huge profit margin. They become incredibly productive. They become incredibly profitable. Some of that filters down to the workers, not a lot, not as much as in some other countries, but it all is an erosion of political and economic rights, and a bolstering of political and social stability and economic stability. So there's less rights, more certainty. So on top of that, we have other elements that also play a part in fascism. There are different flavors of fascism. For example, the Italian fascism, very much the way I described it. Not so much anti-foreigners. There is a little bit of element of that, but it's more anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist. In Germany, they take that a step further and they start to add in a racial component, uh, partly tied to Hitler's anti-Jewish and anti-foreigner rants, but also tapping into the deep-seated racism that is latent in most European societies. Let's transition a little bit to deregulation. This is an important part. that happens in both liberal economies and totalitarian or fascist colonies rather, economies rather. The deregulation essentially means the laws that govern the behaviors of certain industries or certain financial institutions are repealed, that they are taken away. So you can think about it this way: you have a road which has guardrails, it has lots of signs, it has lots of speed limit signs, and maybe police patrolling that road. You have speed bumps, you have all of these devices that are put in place to increase the amount of safety in that road. So if you're not going very fast, if you have an accident, it's more likely you're going to survive. It's less likely you're going to kill bystanders. It's less likely you're going to do some kind of lasting damage. It also means that you will not be able to progress quite as fast. There's a lot more difficulty. There's a lot more trepidation, a little bit more slow pace of movement. So you trade one for the other. Deregulation is taking away a lot of those safety mechanisms, taking away the speed bumps or the guardrails or the police patrolling the road, meaning you can get to your destination a much faster. You can do things a lot with a lot more alacrity. You have a lot more freedom to change lanes, to change direction, whatever. But it also means there's an increased risk. And deregulation can be taken to an extreme. In addition to taking away the guardrails, maybe you take away the dotted lines that tell one lane from another. You take away the lights, you take away the speed limit signs, that sort of thing, and eventually you get to a point where it becomes dangerous. So there's an important balance that needs to be struck. In terms of the 1920s, that means that a lot of financial institutions in particular are allowed to speculate on Wall Street. They begin to make bets. Speculation is very a very innocuous euphemism for laying bets. Whenever you gamble at a roulette wheel, you're putting your money on a certain number or a certain color in the hopes that you're going to get an incredible windfall. Some people bet against you, some people bet with you, that sort of thing. And that's essentially what speculation is. I believe that the stock market's going to go up. I believe the stock market's going to go down. I believe this person's going to default on that loan, that sort of thing. And it leads to some people beginning to cheat the system. So this was a problem in the 1890s. There were restrictions put in place in the early 1900s, the 1910s, that was repealed in the 1920s. So you get things like insider trading. I have special knowledge that the public doesn't have just yet. And so I'm going to hurry up and sell stocks before those tank. A good example of that is recently there was quite the scandal of certain senators selling stock in cruise lines and airlines ahead of the announcement that coronavirus was going to be a problem. And they sold that stock and then bought stock in companies that were going to provide personal protective equipment or PPE. They claim that this was it just happened to be a coincidence. But a lot of people are calling baloney on that because they did this action after they received important inside information before it became publicly available that affected those two particular industries. So that is an example of insider trading. It is illegal for everybody except those in Congress. Why is it not illegal for those in Congress? Because honestly, the American people have not voted out the people who don't bring up these bills. If you're tired of corruption in your government, do something about it. You can't just complain about it, you have to do something about it. So that's my little political rant for now. Also, you get the intermingling of savings banks and commercial banks. Commercial banks give money to businesses so they can get going. Savings banks are the ones that provide money for your home, your car, provide you a credit card and a checking account and that sort of thing. The two were intended to be apart. They began to commingle again in the early 1900s throughout the 1920s. It becomes a disastrous marriage, very profitable for the banks in the short run, very bad news for the economy in the long run. We're back there again in the early 2000s, I'm sorry, 1990s and early 2000s. The laws that prevented this kind of cross-pollination uh, were repealed, and so we had a runaway expansion of the stock market, and then a financial contraction or collapse in 2008. We are facing another financial collapse now with coronavirus, and we're starting to see that perhaps we should have kept banks and commercial banks and savings banks separate because there are banks failing. There's several in West Virginia that have already pulled up stakes and had to be bailed out by the federal government and have been dissolved. It's going to happen more. It's going to expand to more. And perhaps one day we will learn our lessons from history. Speaking of learning our lessons from history, the New Deal. The New Deal is an American phenomena that is a raft of political programs and economic programs that are intended to resuscitate the American economy after the crash on Wall Street in 1929. Now, some of these may seem familiar. That includes giving money to workers, giving money to farmers to continue farming, supporting farmers who are trying to struggle in a market that is bottoming out. Giving money to artists to paint, giving money to musicians to create music, giving money to teachers to keep teaching, giving money to schools to keep them afloat so they keep the kids in school and that sort of thing. Uh, it also enacted several work and labor regulations that helped bring adult males back into the economy, increasingly throughout the Great Depression from 1929 to about 1932. Men bore the brunt of layoffs. Men bore the brunt of economic plight. Women less so. Children absolutely less so. Children were still being used in American labor all the way into the New Deal, to the 1930s. So things like ending child labor were done not as a moral issue. It wasn't seen as a moral issue, although many decried it as a moral issue, like these children should be learning, not working in coal mines or in factories or whatever. But it was seen more of an economic issue. If you tell them they can't hire children, that forces companies to hire men, adults, who then are able to provide for their families, and it creates more social stability. So that sort of thing. And also being able to unionize legally without fear of repercussions, being able um, to protest with work stoppages that became legal. It enforced safety regulations, making sure that the machinery that you were working with wouldn't cost you a limb or an eye or your life, that sort of thing. Making sure that the chemicals that you're working with weren't going to cause cancer, making sure that the water you were going to drink was going to be clean, that sort of thing. So that's a whole grouping of the New Deal policies and just kind of a sampling of them. It was a radical and vast restructuring of the U.S. economy away from a more laissez-faire, free market capitalist, and often very dangerous for workers who would be injured or sickened or whatever, or unemployed suddenly, and more towards a um, less laissez-faire market, more of a regulated market that did expand the American middle class. It expanded rights. And for instance, if you are enjoying a Saturday and a Sunday off, if you're enjoying national holidays, religious holidays, things like Christmas and Easter, or Thanksgiving off, that is largely because of the New Deal. And it's largely because unions really pushed for those to be off. If you like an 8-hour day, if you like getting paid overtime, if you like that if you get injured on the job, you can file for workman's compensation. That is all thanks to the unionization, which in turn is thanks to the New Deal policies. So there we go. So in the Roaring Twenties, in the 1920s, Western liberal economies were doing very well. The best of them was the United States. The United States had a lot of money from those loans coming in from World War One. Britain was paying those back. There was a lot of money that was flowing in the U.S. economy. So the U.S. economy is extremely strong. A lot of foreign countries, a lot of foreign investors, foreign companies begin to invest in the American economy because everybody likes a winner. So the U.S. becomes a kind of the focus for economic expansion in the early 20th century. Now, interestingly enough, at the same time, the United States policy-wise becomes increasingly isolationist. We've kind of touched on the fact that after World War One, the United States did not participate in the League of Nations. The United States decided that it was not interested in becoming an integral part of the very body it proposed. And so it was more keen to look inward, very protectionist, very uh, um, internally motivated to look at their own economy and less so at the world economy, ignoring completely and totally the fact that the American economy had become integral to the world economy. So even though a lot of policies, whether it's diplomatic or economic, were aimed at promoting America first, it was ironically good for the world economy. European economies were recovering from World War One. Luckily, colonies were very much untouched by the wars. So African colonies and Asian colonies were largely untouched. So that's good for the Europeans. Not so good for the people living in the colonies who had to deal, as we mentioned before, with that increasingly harsh reaction to their economic, social, and political demands. And there becomes widespread pressure to deregulate things like banks and trading to open up new avenues of investment, new avenues of liquidity, new avenues of credit. Credit is basically taking on debt with the promise of paying it back with interest, just like credit card, a home loan, or an equity loan, or anything, or personal loan, that sort of thing. What became increasingly popular in the 1920s were unsecured credits, unsecured loans. So, for example, if you take out a home loan or even a home equity loan, you're saying the value of my house is X. I want to borrow a certain portion of X in order to maybe add a new bathroom into my house, or my house needs repairs, or I need to send my son to college or whatever like that. And if I default, I'm going to give you my house. That's secured debt. Unsecured debt is things like a credit card, a personal loan, that sort of thing, where you're just going on your word that you're going to pay this back. That unsecured loans allows for a very affluent lifestyle, because if you can't afford it now, well, you can put it on credit and just pay it off a little bit at a time. Now, those interest rates do tend to be very high. So in the 1920s, for example, it wouldn't be unheard of to have a 30 or 40% interest rate on an unsecured debt, right? Just depends on your credit worthiness, basically. So it wasn't always rosy, however. In general, wealth increased in most Western liberalized countries, in general. But there were some gaps in those who made a lot of money and those who didn't make very much money. In other words, a increasing number of working class people and even lower middle class people felt themselves not gaining as much ground as their more affluent peers, their bosses, the industry owners, the bank rollers or whatever like that. There's also increasing racial tensions that go hand in hand with this. A good example of this is in Tulsa in 1922. There was a very affluent black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was often referred to as the Black Wall Street because those businesses, those black-owned businesses and neighborhoods, were increasingly affluent because they had ties to other economic avenues, whereas local white communities were being left behind because they didn't have as many economic opportunities through their own economic channels. So this was the standard economic channel that was leaving the predominantly white neighborhoods behind. It seemed like the black people were somehow taking that money away from the white people, and so there was this riot that started. It was actually a racist uprising that was led by the Ku Klux Klan. They rampaged through black neighborhoods, burning down black buildings, robbing black-owned banks, murdering black citizens, and it became this huge massacre that was largely swept under the rug in the 1920s. So there's increasing racial tensions along with those economic gaps. Personal credit does expand in general for most people. Being able to buy things on credit and live beyond your means absolutely became the byword of the day. A good example of that is the Great Gatsby. If you've ever read or watched The Great Gatsby, that kind of lavish lifestyle became admired. And so people felt that they needed to keep up with their neighbors, to keep up appearances, to show that they had new cars, new clothes, new appliances, whatever. This leads to inflation, that as more goods are demanded, more and more the prices go up. And that's good in general for the profits or the bottom lines of companies. That feeds the stock market. The stock market begins to kind of go up year over year over year. But then by about 1926, 1927, people begin to kind of sound the alarm bell that this may be indeed not legitimate growth, but more of a speculative bubble. Remember that talk about gambling before? People betting for or betting against. A lot of people were betting that the stock market was going to rise, so expectations were that it was going to rise. And so this feeds this kind of belief that the good times will never end. The reality is, much like in physics, everything that goes up must come down. That is absolutely true in economics. Everything that goes up must come down. There's all sorts of euphemisms that economists use for that kind of thing. They call it market corrections, or they call it a readjustment or a realignment. Sometimes they call it a bear market, that sort of thing. But we're going to call it for what it is historically, a Great Depression. There's a bubble that's building up. It's getting bigger, getting bigger, getting bigger. Eventually, it's going to pop, and when it does, it's going to bring a lot of people down with it. And it absolutely happens. In 1927, banks begin to start feeling a little leery because those interest rates are really high. People are beginning to default on that unsecured credit. So they begin to kind of stranglehold the credit. The credit's not as free flowing as it was before. They're doing the sort of responsible thing, the thing that they should have been doing beforehand, being a little bit more judicious in giving credit away. And unfortunately, they tend to overreact in 1927. So this leads to what's known as a credit freeze. It becomes incredibly hard to get credit. Well, when you can't get credit, maybe you can't get the loans you need to keep your business afloat. Maybe you can't get the loans you need to keep your house afloat. So maybe you start buying less. You begin to kind of pay the hangover price for that lavish lifestyle that you've been living. Or in some cases, in most cases, just because the inflation has caused prices to go up and you have to take out loans in order to afford farm equipment, in order to afford seed and fertilizer, in order to maintain your business afloat, make sure that your repair garage or your bakery or your dry cleaners is able to stay competitive with the neighbors, but prices are really high, so you've got to take out some credit. That unsecured credit is called in. You're no longer able to purchase, say, dry cleaning material or oil for your mechanic's garage or new tools or hire new people. And so you have this kind of collapse of buying. And it creates a vicious cycle that as more people feel the need to kind of cut back on their spending, companies are not getting as much profit, so they're not turning in as much money to their credit, to their creditors, to their banks, and we start seeing that kind of dip in speculation in Wall Street. By October 1929, the US stock market crashes, loses about a third of its value in a single day. The second closest loss of value that we've had is actually just recently, just earlier this month, that massive collapse that we had. It was the worst since the 1930s. And that's largely because people begin to realize, oh crap, the tide is turning. It's time for me to sell these stocks off. And then as people start to sell those stocks off, other people begin to panic. They begin to panic sell, much like panic buying for toilet paper or hand sanitizer in the coronavirus. You have panic selling as well in the stock market. That also recently happened. People started seeing stock markets go down, projections go down, worries about unemployment go up. So people are like, I better hurry up and get the hell out of this stock and get my money while the getting's good. Well, then that causes prices to go down rather quickly. Banks begin to call in a lot of loans that had been used to speculate on the stock market. I told you there was a lot of gambling going along, so you take out a huge unsecured loan in order to buy stocks in the hope that the stock market will give you enough return on investment that you can pay off that loan. Well, what happens when the stock market suddenly isn't worth as much as it was before, when it's one third or a half or a tenth what it was before? Well, now you can't pay your unsecured loan, and so, the bank is left holding the bag. That bank had used its savers' money, the people who had deposited money in those banks, to be able to speculate on that. And so you have banks begin to collapse. That means that people's savings, even people who did not speculate on Wall Street, the people who did not live beyond their means, they were wiped out. So mom and pop, who had been very careful and saved their money in the bank, suddenly don't have the bank up and running. If you ever watch the movie It's a Wonderful Life, you can see played out in real time a scenario of a bank run, a collapse on a bank, because that does take place during the Great Depression. So, in answer to all of this economic and political uncertainty that comes with it, the European, many European countries begin to experiment with abandoning capitalism and liberal Western democracies, some a little bit earlier than others. For example, Italy in 1919, a man named Benito Mussolini, who had been a soldier in World War One, he used to be a very dyed-in-the-wool socialist. He had abandoned the socialist movement and really gravitated towards ultra right wing fascism. And he begins to capitalize upon economic and political frustration that's happening in Italy. So, as I mentioned before, most economies were expanding. Italy's wasn't, Germany's wasn't. So that explains, at least in part, why those two gravitated more towards fascism than others. In Italy in 1919, Benito Mussolini begins to consolidate power. He begins to increase his, I guess, name recognition would be a good way to characterize it. And he particularly goes after socialism. He begins to lay a lot of the problems that are happening in Italy at the feet of socialism and those ungrateful socialist workers who want better wages, who want more time off, that sort of thing. Don't they know that the state matters and that the state needs to survive above and beyond all, any, especially individual desires? So one of the ways that he became more recognizable was through the use of violence. His followers, known as the Black Shirts, were a kind of paramilitary group. They were composed largely of veterans of World War I who dressed in black shirted uniforms, carried daggers around, or big knives basically, and would attack people that they deemed were enemies of the state. So this violence would create uncertainty, social uncertainty. And then, of course, Benito Mussolini would come in and say, well, I'm the only one who can really stop this violence, give me a chance, give me an opportunity. And the Italians did, of course, vote for him. He eventually becomes the kind of uh, quasi-totalitarian ruler over Italy by 1922. In Germany, a young man named Adolf Hitler, former painter and veteran of World War I himself, had been tapped to keep an eye on one of the rising socialist parties in Germany, known as the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, also known as the Nazis or National Socialists. He was tapped in 1921 to become kind of a spy for the movement or inside the movement. Eventually, however, he became fascinated with the power that accrued himself within that movement because he was very passionate, very articulate, very charismatic, strangely energetic, somebody who caused people to kind of gravitate towards him. Um, he uh, takes his role as a member of the National Socialist Workers' Party relatively seriously, except he wants to take it in a different direction, much like Mussolini took the socialism in a different direction towards fascism. Hitler emulates Mussolini and begins to take the National Socialist Workers' Party in a different direction. He begins to make it more right wing. He attempts to stage a coup in Munich. It's called the Beer Hall Push. This area where a lot of politicians hung out. He thought he would take that over, make demands, create a state within a state, and then parlay that into control over Germany. It didn't go too well, and he was arrested and imprisoned. While imprisoned, he wrote this racist, paranoid scree called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, that was smuggled out by his lawyer and printed surreptitiously, like a kind of an underground printer. And essentially, he blames the fact that Germany is not prospering on several factors, including the immigrants, an international conspiracy by Jews, people who were insufficiently German-esque or Aryan, as he called it. This phrase that he sort of picked up and kind of quasi understood, he mistook for being the true humans of the planet, this Aryan race, which had no scientific basis whatsoever, but that didn't matter. So essentially, he blames Jews, the Treaty of Versailles, an international conspiracy, everybody but the German workers. And this resonates with the German population. They too felt left behind. Their neighbors in France and in the United Kingdom, movies from America, that sort of thing. These are all showing this lavish lifestyle, and they feel like they're struggling. Now, it's true that yes, the Treaty of Versailles put an onerous burden on Germany. Absolutely. Was it an international conspiracy? Kind of, but not an active one. It was one that had been set in motion back in 1918. Unfortunately, the repercussions are that a lot of German workers dealt with hyperinflation. They didn't know how much uh, bread would be, or how much fuel would be, or how much apples would be from day to day. You could never really count on the prices. This leads to a lot of social and economic instability. And so, taking a page from the Italian book, the Germans begin to, or the National Socialist Party begins to target enemies of the state or enemies within. And much like the black shirts in Italy, the Nazis began to wear brown shirts, like a deep brown, to signify participation in the National Socialist Party. They began to target communists, Jewish businesses, immigrant businesses, foreign businesses, anybody who they saw as an enemy to the state. And much like Benito Mussolini, Hitler used that violence to say, I'm the only one who can solve this violence, totally ignoring the fact that both Hitler and Mussolini were the instigators of that violence, but they were like, "Oh, I'm the only one who can really solve this violence." They were true to their word. Wherever the National Socialist Party began to dominate, suddenly this street violence began to disappear, and magically it propelled Hitler into a party of prominence. And although they never really won the majority of the vote. As an olive branch, the German government reached out and said, "Hey, why don't you become deputy chancellor? This will quiet some of those factions within Germany that are anti everybody else." And unfortunately, that was the door that opened Pandora's, or that was the crack that opens Pandora's box, and Hitler was able to parlay becoming chancellor and then abrogating the German constitution. So why fascism though? Why does fascism? Why does this ultra right wing xenophobic party appeal to people? Well, there's a lot of factors, but three of them that are really prominent, at least in my mind, are fear. The first one is fear. Fascist governments absolutely, positively thrive on fear. Fear of the other, fear of the outsider, fear of uh, different racial components, fear of different ethnic components, fear of different religious components. And they also capitalized on political uncertainty. Yes, they created a lot of that political uncertainty. There was some there already of not sure where politics were going to go, not sure if the government was responsive enough. It's a very populist movement, and the fascism is very much a populist movement. It gets the people excited. It tells them, "Hey, you're being screwed over. All those fears that you've had about everybody else are absolutely legitimate. We're the ones who can really see you through that. Follow us, and we'll take you there." Uh, Propaganda also played a good part. Propaganda is often not just getting people on your side, but also deceiving them. We've covered that a little bit with World War One of, we're the heroes, we're the shining knights, they're the dragons, they're the monsters, we need to destroy them. They're the bloodthirsty brutes, that sort of thing. And that's a similar thing that's happening within Germany, within Italy. Fascists really latch on to essentially the PR aspect of politics. Uh, One time in Hitler's book Mein Kampf, he mentioned that the great masses of the people will more easily fall victim to the big lie than to the small one. So don't tell a tiny lie. Don't say, "Well, I was in this city at this time," when you really weren't. In other words, you don't want to tell little lies that people can pick apart, and then that puts you on the defensive. If you say a big, bold, brass lie, something that's absolutely positively untrue, but you stick to it and you repeat it again and again and again, people are going to think, on the one hand, wow, he wouldn't possibly say something so outrageous and it not be at least partially true. So, like a conspiracy theory kind of thing. But also, if you stick to that lie, you get to paint anybody who opposes you as enemies of the state. The press is the enemy of the state. The opposition party is the enemy of the state. And also, it stokes fear that these elements, see here, these elements are trying to keep me from telling you the truth, you the people. And so it stokes more fear. So that feeds back into the fear thing. The propaganda also begins to portray the dominant party, the fascist party, as the only party that will have the solution you need for social security, for economic security, for political security. So you have to follow us. And then finally, control. Simple answers are the easiest to put into people's minds. They have so many things to worry about. They have to worry about, my son and daughter going to school. I have to worry about making payments, have to worry about keeping up my house, putting food on the table, keeping the lights on. There's so many things going on. They don't have time to sit down and think about the nuance of certain policies. If you say, I will do this, it will make everything better, and therefore all you have to do is follow me. If you don't follow me, you're going to derail the entire plan. So it's a very simple answer for complex, difficult situations. Germany was in an incredibly complex political and economic situation that led to the disparity in pay for the rest of Europe. But the Germans said, no, it's all because there are Jews. That's it. There are Jews and there are gypsies and they're stealing money from you, and it's part of an international conspiracy. Simple answer. It's a complex problem, but they give a simple answer. It's not necessarily the true answer. So they often float conspiracy theories. They offer scapegoats, easy targets, things that are easy to pick out. If you say, well, there's a lot of economic problems that are happening in the world and there's some speculation on the stock market, these are very abstract concepts. But if you say the person who lives down the road from you, the person who owns that business that bought you out, the person who runs the bank who denied you that loan that caused your business to fail, that's the reason why you're having trouble. It's easier to grasp on that. You see that person, you know that bank, you know that house. And so it's much more concrete to find scapegoats than it is to try to teach people about policy nuance. So German fascism really is an excellent example of the way in which fascism kind of co-opts a lot of the language of socialism, but then twists it. So they give you one thing, it's kind of a bait and switch. They give you one idea and then substitute it for something maybe that's more in a corporation's interest or the government's interest. Uh, German, much like the Italian economy, was in shambles after World War One. Didn't really recover the way that French and English economies recovered. Didn't even recover in a comparable manner to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union seemed to be doing at least outwardly fairly well compared to Germany and Italy. So Germany and Italy begin to embrace this need to expand, that expanding the territory of the country, expanding the holdings of the German people or the Italian people will lead to better economic opportunities. What's the best way to expand that territory? Well, it's to go to war. So, in abrogation of the Versailles Treaty, Germany begins to rebuild the Navy and the Army. This puts a lot of people back to work. They work in manufacture, munitions, clothing, food, training. They get a job in the military, you name it. So the Navy is growing, the Air Force is growing, Luftwaffe, if you will, is growing. The Army is growing, and this makes Germany seem much more strong. And in fact, it does become very militarily strong. There's also an emphasis on innovation, on creating new designs for weaponry and for rocketry and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of research and development that feeds universities, that feeds professors and physicists and mathematicians and that sort of thing. Um, Hand in hand with this expansion is people's wages are not really going up quite as much as they might have expected. But a lot of that is papered over because the part of the artificial inflation of the German economy is geared towards providing cheap products for the German people. A good example would be the Volkswagen, the people's car. Very socialist sounding, but it wasn't. It was not very socialist at all. It was a very planned economy, yes, but it was a right-wing planned economy. It was very anti-capitalist. That's absolutely true. Or the Volkskuche. the People's Kitchen. It was kind of a soup line for workers who worked at certain factories. So factories provided lunch for you, so you didn't have to bring in lunch. So maybe you didn't grumble so much about not earning as much as you could. You were at least working, and hey, they fed you. Oh, and now I can afford a car, like I see in those American pictures, or I see my French or British colleagues driving around in. So now we have our own car industry. We have our own people's car. And hand in hand with this is a corporatist kind of economic scheme in which the government told companies, okay, this is what you're going to produce. You're going to have a monopoly on producing it, but in return for that, you're going to be loyal to the party. Some of the profits are going to go to help keeping the party in power, and you're going to give a few of these small bones to the workers. So things like days off for national holidays, so that they can compulsorily attend the Nazi rallies. The food kitchens that I talked about before, or financing schemes so they can buy a new car or they can add on to their house. So for those who were not oppressed, the Nazi regime was actually pretty good for them economically. They did start going up. It was better for those who were rich and affluent, who had the access to power, way better. They lived lavish lifestyles with champagne and exotic foods and wonderful big houses and that sort of thing. And that was built largely because these corporations and farms and labor that was needed to be done, the more unskilled labor, was done by a slave population, and that was increasingly the Jewish population. The Jews were initially rounded up and sent to work camps where they would build roads, where they would farm, where they would dig ditches and canals and you name it. And this stuff just seemed to magically appear to those who were blissfully ignorant as to what was happening to their Jewish neighbors. So essentially, slave labor artificially inflates the value of the non-slave labor. It makes it seem like we have a higher standard of living, that Germany is progressing. We don't have to worry about the things that we were worried about before the Nazi Party. Things are getting better. We don't have to look under the hood. We don't want to see how the sausage is made. Now, the United States takes a different tack. In the United States, the Great Depression sparks a sea change in the political arena. Now, before 1932, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected, the Democratic and Republican Party were really very similar. They were very much pro-corporation. They were very much deregulation. They were very much uh, kind of flip side of the same coin. Under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he sees this as an opportunity to really set the Democratic Party apart. And this is where the Democratic Party becomes more of a progressivist or liberalist party. And it is under him, and it continues all the way into the 1960s. It goes through some changes and then becomes what's known as third wave Democrats under the 1990s, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposes something called a New Deal. This idea that the United States would restructure radically its economy. It was optimistic that the government and a solution can be found and fixed by a progressivist, forward-looking government. That the economic situation is dire, yes. The laissez-faire, let's let private charities take care of the needy, let's let the situation play itself out, isn't working. We've been in a depression for 3.5 years now. Let's do something new. So the progressivist government can rebuild and can do it in a much more efficient manner than the decentralized laissez-faire economic system can. In many ways, the New Deal co-ops the language of socialists and communists. They take some of the ideas, for example, of unionizing or of worker safety or of banning child labor. They take that and they co-opt it and rebrand and restructure capitalism and make it more regulated. A regulated capitalist society is better than a socialist economy, is better than a communist, way better than a communist economy. So just trust us, basically. It's a very reformist and it addresses some of the roots of economic inequality. A good example that I mentioned before is the ending of child labor. Child labor was cheap. You could pay children way, 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 way less than you could adults. By ending child labor, those jobs still needed to be filled, but now the wages could be paid to adults who would demand higher wages. Part of the reason why they were able to demand higher wages was through unionization. A good example of this would be in the 1930s. General Motors refused to meet workers' demands, and typically when there was a strike, as happened with General Motors, General Motors would just call in a favor with the local governor, who would then send in the National Guard, who would then either, in some cases, brutalize the workers and make them leave the factory, or shoot them, kill them, that sort of thing. It absolutely happened several times through American history. Well, this time Franklin Delano Roosevelt responds, and he sends in the U.S. military, and GM is quite thrilled. They let the military go in, the military goes in, sets up machine gun emplacements on top of the buildings, of the GM buildings, and protects the workers and prevents strike breakers from trying to come in and beat up the strikers, and thus forcing GM to come to the negotiation table. This leads to raises in wages, increased safety, a pension plan, days off, limits on hours, that sort of thing. So the unionization of workers really does propel wages upward. Also, in order to build confidence in the economy again, remember I mentioned before, even people who had not speculated on Wall Street lost money in banks because banks went bankrupt. Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, part of the New Deal programs was the Federal Depositors Insurance Company, or FDIC. Every time you go into Fifth Third or PNC or Chase Bank or whatever, you should see a sign that says insured by the FDIC, Federal Depositors Insurance Company. All the money that you put in up to $100,000 would be covered by this insurance scheme that banks have to pay into. Every year, for every dollar that you put in, they put in a few pennies for every dollar that you put in, and they pay insurance over year over year over year. If, for whatever reason, they go bankrupt, the federal government cashes in that insurance policy and pays out all of the money that you may have lost. This is to rebuild confidence in banks so that banks can then go about pumping money back into the economy. Also ensures care for the elderly. I mentioned this before about Social Security, and we'll mention it again. Taking the elderly out of the market pool, out of the labor pool, rather. Just like taking children out of the labor pool, also ensures that young, healthy men who have families to support can get back to work. Because, again, elderly having to work, if they have money at home, that can keep them afloat, maybe not in luxury, but at least keep them from starving to death, they don't need to work. If they don't need to work, that opens up jobs for young men in particular to find work and support families. So there are some myths and legends that are surrounding the New Deal that come up a lot during these discussions about the New Deal. The first is that the New Deal didn't end the Great Depression, World War II did. Well, this is largely false. The US actually didn't reach pre-1929 levels until 1954, partly because of how deep the depression was. I cannot overstate how much wealth was lost in the span of a couple of weeks. The Great Depression really was a bottoming out of the stock market. Billions with a big B were lost in a time when being a millionaire was just an amazing amount of money, an astounding amount of money at a time when a loaf of bread cost a nickel, that kind of thing. So losing billions of dollars would be the equivalent of losing hundreds of trillions of dollars now. So it took a little while. World War II did show the power of state-funded production and work programs. Absolutely. Wages were increased for workers. Production was directed by the U.S. state and paid for through bonds that were taken out, basically loans uh, provided by the American people. Every time you buy a treasury bond, you're giving money to the government. You're loaning money to the government that's going to pay it back in interest. It's not a very great interest, but it's interest nonetheless. The employment and standard of living trend goes up throughout the 1930s. It dips in 1937, largely because of the ending of certain programs, because of legal challenges, that sort of thing. Some of these programs, some of these New Deal programs were deemed unconstitutional and struck down by the Supreme Court. So that laid off a bunch of people. So, but in general, the U.S. economy doesn't really come back to pre-1929 levels until the 1950s. It also discounts the millions of Americans who die or were maimed in war. And it begs the question, are people dying worth resuscitating the economy? Could you have gotten the economy resuscitated without World War II? Maybe. We don't know. That's antithetical to history. That's speculative history, and it takes into account a lot of assumptions. Like if we would have let the Great Depression play out instead of introducing the New Deal, would the Great Depression have ended earlier? I sincerely don't think so. Economically, socially speaking, it was desperate times. People were getting very angry. Participation in the Communist Party of America as well as the Nazi Party of America were increasing, and so we would have probably wound up with a new civil war, in my opinion. But again, that's ahistorical and that's just speculation. So, second one is the USA isn't a socialist country or the New Deal failed. Well, that's mostly false. The New Deal improved wages, work hours, and representation for American workers. Also, the New Deal's most powerful program, Social Security, is still an important institution today and inspired a lot of other programs further on down in American history. Things like Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, welfare, that sort of thing. Now, does it 100% solve problems? Yeah, it doesn't 100% solve problems. There are some problems with the New Deal. There were some things that were struck down. They were unconstitutional. They may have overpromised and underdelivered. Absolutely. But mostly false. The United States is indeed a semi-socialist country. A lot of people don't think of fire departments as socialism, but it is. Police departments socialism. They are international or interstate highway system, absolutely socialism. State parks, socialism. The Social Security Administration, socialism, right there. So the New Deal improved America far quicker than letting the Great Depression play out. I mentioned this just a moment ago. That's debatable. The New Deal didn't address all of the issues or even most issues evenly. A good example of this is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It was a program set up to help support struggling farmers who were losing their farms to foreclosure because they had taken out loans for farm equipment, seed, fertilizer, you name it. And they couldn't pay that back because the price for their products had bottomed out in the Great Depression, so they were losing their farms, quite literally. The bank was coming in and taking their farms away. So how did that address people losing their farms? Well, it didn't really help address the people who had already lost their farms. It kept people from losing more, or kept more people from losing their farms by buoying prices, by giving minimum floor prices for grain. Sometimes this meant paying people not to grow. That would force the price of, say, corn or wheat or barley or soy or whatever to inflate. It also didn't address sharecroppers who were often employed in the South the money that was paid through the Agricultural Adjustment Act was paid to the landowners, not to the actual workers. So this left a lot of sharecroppers in poverty. Um, some programs like Workman's Comp and the Social Security Administration and regulations on working didn't cover domestic workers who were invariably in the 1930s black. So this didn't really help black workers establish, say, Social Security benefits. They didn't even get Social Security cards most of the time. So did it really help the United States much more quickly than letting the Great Depression play out? We don't know. That's ahistorical. My opinion is it definitely kept the United States from devolving into a much more scary, much more violent, possibly even a fractured place. But that's just my opinion. So, in a nutshell, dealing with the Great Depression in Europe, we've already covered Japan last week. We talked about Japan embracing a kind of semi-fascism or pseudo-fascism. Europe is embracing fascism, a far-right uh, totalitarian movement that is suspicious of capitalism, that is suspicious of liberal democracy, that is suspicious of outsiders. They want to root out enemies of the state. They rule through fear and intimidation, and they prioritize stability over freedom. In the United States, there's a co-opting of socialist rhetoric and a restructuring and rebranding of capitalism. It is absolutely remains a very capitalist society. There's free market. There is regulations. There are rules put in place to prevent a return to normalcy. So yeah, millionaires had to pay prices. Yeah, millionaires got wiped out. Absolutely. Rich people got wiped out. Absolutely. But the pain was ameliorated by the fact that companies could then start hiring more workers. They could start selling more products. And in general, life was better in 1936 than it was in 1932. It was not nearly as good as it was in 1928 or 1927, but you take what you can. They began to expand rights for the majority, but it was an imperfect expansion. I mentioned the racism before that left a lot of black communities, especially in the South, out of this expanding social network. The United States um, New Deal was very popular. It was uh, a very populist movement, much like fascism was. It did need to engage in lots of propaganda. It did need to engage in a lot of advertising for these programs. Um, and the question remains: was that the best way to ensure that the American people had the greatest benefit of these policies? Well, probably not. But in general, life expectancy increased, family stability increased, the divorce rate dropped, suicide rate dropped, domestic violence dropped, in general under the New Deal. And the United States emphasized stability through freedom, through the ability to protest in the workplace, through the ability to make your voice heard the political arena. So the political arena became more responsive to the needs of the people. Now, I mentioned before that Italian and German fascism was very, very similar. There's one huge difference, though. Both Italy and Germany, the core of these fascist movements were founded by veterans of World War I who were disillusioned with the post-war society in which they found themselves. Uh, Both of them were anti-democratic. They both erode or in some cases completely tear up the constitution of their country. They do away with a lot of freedoms. They do away with a lot of political dissent. They are also predicated on coming into power not through populist programs, but through populist intimidation. So vigilante violence, they were very anti-communist. The difference was in Germany, there was a racial element. that wasn't really present as much in Italy or in the other fascist country of Spain, which we're not really going to talk about because they remained neutral during World War II. So this anti-Jewish element really is promulgated by Hitler and his kind of cult of personality. And so how do we wind up with a right wing fascist regime that still calls itself socialist? Well, that's largely because the socialism was rooted out by Hitler and his clique, his group of insiders. Now, within any movement, within any body politic, you're going to have caucuses or cliques or circles of friends that are probably going to be similar in attitudes and probably have some kind of leader. A good example is within the Republican Party, there's the Freedom Caucus that they are not necessarily um, anti-Republican, but they have a different agenda than the rest of the body politic of the Republican Party. Same thing within the Democratic Party. There's this progressivist movement, I think they're called Justice Democrats, that have maybe a different agenda than the Democratic Party writ large. So we have within the National Socialist Party, we have increasingly two different poles. They have two different factions, if you will, within the Socialist Party. You have the old guard socialists who were very idealistic. They were rhetorically aimed at addressing some of the social ills that they see within the economic and political system. Then you also have the increasingly conservative who is talking about social stability. At times, they had different agendas, they wanted different things, but by and large, they operated in unison. It seems weird to talk about a socialist and a conservative body working together, but that's the way that these politics work. Within the party, however, they were unified in this disdain and mistrust of the unregulated capitalist system. To their minds, the unregulated capitalist system is what causes a lot of problems for Germany. And within those two parties, well, within those two factions, there are people who are increasingly violently oriented towards capitalism and towards liberal democracies. Within the conservative, you have Adolf Hitler and his small clique of friends. These groups or the group subgroup within that group. Okay, and Adolf Hitler initially enters the party to disrupt it, to exacerbate those tensions between the conservative and the socialist factions, to maybe make them infight and collapse. It doesn't work out quite that way. Instead, he finds that he enjoys being kind of the center of attention. He enjoys having his ideas heard. And he begins to cultivate friendships, well, I should say useful partnerships with people within the National Socialist Party. People he refers to later on as useful idiots on both the socialist and the conservative side. Once he gets what he wants, however, once he becomes not only the leader of the National Socialist Party, but also becomes Chancellor of Germany, then he executes his real agenda, which is to get rid of anybody within the party who is not loyal to him. This is an event called the Night of Long Knives, where the opposition party or the opposition within the National Socialist Party was killed, literally assassinated. And they targeted socialist and conservative leaders within the Nazi Party. Now, let me tell you how ironic it becomes. Uh, because Hitler was within that faction of the National Socialist Party that was very conservative, anti-Bolshevik, anti-socialist, he got people within the Conservative Party to execute or to assassinate or to assault and kill the people in the Socialist Party. Once they were done killing that with that kill list, he had his clique kill those people so that he could distance himself. He said, "Oh, these brutes within my party who attacked other honored friends within the party. They've been dealt with. They've met with street justice and have been dealt with swiftly. I will prove to you once and for all that I am the center of the National Socialist Party. I will take control and I will provide stability and harmony for everybody. Well, he's already taken out all of his rivals, quite literally. So who's going to say boo to him? So we have a looming storm. We have in the 1930s this kind of storm on the horizon. Germany and Italy are leading Europe towards more totalitarian and fascistic rule. They aid the Spanish fascists in their civil war to suppress the loyalist. Ernest Hemingway fought on the loyalist side, who was fighting for the King of Spain. Unfortunately, they were on the losing side. The Nazis also inspire the British and French fascists. They motivate American fascists. It seems like fascism is the wave of the future. It's a very future-looking party. Both Italy and Germany invade territory. Germany invades Austria and the Czech Republic, what would later become Czechoslovakia, and then back to the Czech Republic. Italy invades Libya and Ethiopia, and they begin to aggressively expand their military power. So how do these other countries respond to this aggression? Well, if you're the United Kingdom and your prime minister is Neville Chamberlain, he negotiates peace within our time. He essentially cedes certain territory or gives up any kind of uh, opposition to Germany acquiring territory in Czechoslovakia, what's known as the Sudetenland. The reason for this is twofold. First, they thought that it would be such a difficult place to administer that that would occupy Germany's time, that any reasonable government would take a long time to try to sort out the racial and ethnic and religious divisions that are inherent within Czechoslovakia, and this will occupy them. Haha, little do they know that, Hitler would take a very simplistic approach and just get rid of people he didn't like, literally murder people. And second of all, the United Kingdom was not willing to enter into another war. They were not willing to fight, especially over territorial claims in the Balkans. Did not want to repeat that mess. This is the specter of World War One. It is barely 20 years after the end of World War One. It is still within living memory. The people who are in their 40s and 50s remember fighting in the trenches. The United Kingdom is absolutely 100% against this idea of going to war with Germany. Had Neville Chamberlain gone in and said, if you invade the Sudetenland, if you invade Czechoslovakia, Britain will go to war against you, that would not have checked Hitler, and it would have also cost Neville Chamberlain his prime ministership. He would have been out. So he was caught in a no-win situation. The United States, Roosevelt was worried increasingly about the rise of fascism in Europe, also the rise of pseudo-fascism in Japan, and began trying to expand the military. However, Congress, which had a Republican majority in the Senate, really opposed Roosevelt's expansion of the military and passed legislation that really forced Roosevelt to kind of sit on his hands. Passed a resolution that said the United States would be neutral in any conflicts that were coming up. That neutrality meant that we couldn't supply anything to anybody, any belligerent power. Anybody who was at war, they could not have oil, steel, food, medicine. They couldn't have anything. Why? Well, part of it was motivated by sympathy for fascism. There were very sympathetic people in the United States who were friendly towards fascism. Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh were two of the most prominent Americans at the time. They were very pro-fascist, but also a kind of lingering doubt about whether the United States really wanted to get involved in foreign affairs again. That the devastation of World War One and the issues that we face at home are reason enough not to get involved in a fight overseas. Let the Europeans sort it out. Now, the Soviet Union also saw the rise of Hitler maybe a little differently in the beginning than it did very shortly after, by about 1940-41. The Soviet Union had struck a deal with the Germans to divide up Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. Basically, they moved some borders around. The Soviet Union moved into eastern part of Poland and occupied it and made it basically a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Germany moved into the western part of Poland, and poor Poland fell pretty quickly. And this is one of the reasons why France gets into the war. Now, why was the Soviet Union eager to make deals with Germany? Well, again, the specter of World War I, that memory of the fight in World War I, where the Russian troops were, although very brave and fought valiantly, they were under-equipped, they were underprepared, they had no food coming to them, they had no fuel coming to them, and it was just a horror. So only 20 years ago that they had left the Great War, and they didn't want to repeat that. But also, Joseph Stalin, felt a certain kind of affection or affinity towards Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was very charming by all accounts. He could be very persuasive, very friendly. He had moments of whimsy. He seemed like a guy who just wanted the best for his country if you talked to him directly. And this is just me speculating from all the stuff that I've read from the personal accounts of people when they meet Hitler. Hitler seemed very likable, affable. He didn't seem like a crazy guy who was just, frothing at the mouth. He seemed like he had his head on straight. Maybe he had some kind of wild ideas, but that was just, the way of progressives or the way of the future. Maybe you needed radical ideas to address these problems. And so Joseph Stalin really kind of liked Adolf Hitler, and he trusted him, which is weird for a famously paranoid guy who would have people killed because he thought maybe they could possibly in the future conspire against him. He had doctors, his own doctors, murdered because he thought maybe those doctors weren't telling him the truth or they weren't telling him what he wanted to hear. Go figure, right? But Hitler, he trusted, absolutely. And so they were unprepared for World War II when it would come to their doorstep. France was in possession at the time of the world's largest military. They were bigger than Germany. They were bigger than the United States. They were bigger than the UK. And they were watching the rise of Germany with increased apprehension. They armed a series of defensive fortifications along the French and German border, called them the Maginot Line. And they began to say, if you declare war against, say, Poland or against this country or that country, France will declare war against you. It is an attempt to check the power of a rising Germany that the French government is increasingly worried about. They're the ones who are looking at this and saying, that is a monster, we need to take care of it. The rest of the world seems like, maybe later, some other time, we'll kick the can down the road. France is worried that Germany is going to launch another offensive and start taking territory back from France that it had won in the Versailles Treaty. It didn't want that to happen. And so this Maginot Line was intended to be kind of a fortification along the French and German border. Little did they know that the Germans would go, okay, well, we'll just drive around this fortification and invade neutral countries like the Netherlands and Belgium. So go figure. So the quick invasions of the old World War I enemies, particularly of France, allow for Germany to really take the initiative. This new type of warfare called blitzkrieg or lightning warfare really catches Russia, Great Britain, and France off guard. Initially, Russia watches what's happening in the Western Front and going, wow, good thing it's happening to them. Imagine, boy, that would suck if it really happened to us. Let's not worry about it happening to us. We've got this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Later on, however, when Germany thinks that they've pretty much crushed Europe and it's just a matter of time before they crush Britain, they go ahead and enact their second part of their plan, which I'll get to in a minute here, and invade Russia as well. Russia and Great Britain are desperately defending. Perhaps most telling is Russians would often go to war without the proper equipment. They would rely upon seizing German equipment and using it against them. The American isolationism in 1939 and 1940 really prevents Franklin Roosevelt from helping these erstwhile allies out, particularly helping out England. England is desperately calling for aid. There's plans made to evacuate the royal family to Canada, where they will rule in exile in the event that the mainland England is taken. Um, and unfortunately, Franklin Roosevelt's not allowed to send aid or even sell weapons directly. The belligerents initially would have to come to the United States and purchase it and transport it themselves, but then later on the United States passes another resolution saying, no, you can't even do that. So Roosevelt does an end run that eventually is challenged in the Supreme Court, but it doesn't get through the Supreme Court before World War II is over because of different legal maneuverings. And this is a program called the Lend-Lease that the United States would, in exchange for lending the UK destroyers, fuel, tanks, munitions, and that sort of thing, lending it for whatever they want to use it, we will go ahead and lease bases in the Caribbean. It's how the United States acquires the Virgin Islands, or at least in part. It's also how the United States acquires a lot of other territory and bases overseas. Oh, we just want to lease some territory in Greenland, for example, or we want to lease territory in Central America, that sort of thing. And that's held by the British. So we'll go ahead and lease those from you. And in exchange, instead of you giving us money, we'll give you weapons, that sort of thing. Lend-Lease begins to prop up both the United Kingdom and then later on Russia when Russia's invaded. The United States suddenly has a call for manufacturing capacity in a way that had not been present before. So in 1939, we see manufacturing begin to rise. Manufacturing jobs begin to pay very well. They offer a lot more hours. The United States government is buying up all this stuff because, well, we're lending this out, and just make sure you return it when you get back. Imagine renting a car that you're going to drive into a war zone, saying, "Oh, I promise I'll bring it back in one piece." Well, the United States at the same time was also flirting very much with Nazism. The U.S. populace from 1938 to about 1941, the end of 1941, really thought that maybe there'd be a war against Japan, and that was it. They were not interested at all in fighting the Germans or the Italians. They were very sympathetic to the Nazis, and in some polls, it was like 60 or 65% of Americans were sympathetic to the German Reich and to Adolf Hitler himself. U.S. politicians were absolutely uninterested in what's going on in Russia, what's going on in the United Kingdom. That neutrality becomes a very malevolent neutrality. It's kind of like, well, I could stop this fight. I could offer a counterbalance to Germany's push and maybe stop Germany early, but I'm not going to because that's not my fight. I could have stopped it, but I didn't. It's much like you see abuse going on in an open window across the street. You see somebody beating up a kid, beating up their kid, and instead of calling the police, instead of going over there and intervening to keep the man or woman from hurting the kid, you just close your blind and go, well, it's none of my problem. And that's essentially what the United States is doing. And increasingly, the United States see themselves as an island of unto itself, that the oceans are these barriers that are going to prevent problems from coming over. Now, this picture that I have here on the left, then you'll notice that there's a Nazi symbol there. And it would be acceptable if you thought maybe that was maybe Nuremberg or Berlin or someplace like that. This is Madison Square Garden in New York City, where tens of thousands of American Nazis rallied in support of Adolf Hitler in 1941. So it lets you know just how sympathetic Americans were towards the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, Japan is expanding into China and the Pacific Islands. They're engaging in ethnic cleansing in a similar vein that Germany is, uh, and they hit upon a plan to knock out their strongest competitor, which is the United States. And this leads to the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. As soon as the United States declares war on Japan, Germany declares war on the United States as part of an alliance pact known as the Axis. Well, once the United States declares war on, or once the United States is declared war upon, propaganda goes into overdrive, painting Hitler as a crazy man, as rapacious, as a monster, and being a member of the National Socialist Party of America is really unpopular. So a lot of those people go into hiding. They don't abandon their beliefs. They don't give up their ideas, but they definitely stay quiet during the war effort. Now, there's some blunders that are made in World War II. Germany was super successful at first. They had very strong innovation for their military tactics, for their technology, but they unfortunately opened a two-front war voluntarily. They thought that Operation Adlertag, which is Operation Eagle Day, which is the invasion of England, was going to happen very quickly. It didn't. It was an unexpected failure. So in anticipation that that was going to happen, they wanted to pivot very quickly and invade Russia, Operation Barbarossa, and knock Russia out. Because at the end of the day, Hitler hated nothing more than, well, Jews. Well, but second, very close second, were Bolsheviks, communists, and he hated Stalin. Hitler hated Stalin and thought he was an idiot, a brute, somebody who wasn't very intelligent. These are all of his personal writings. At the same time that Stalin is writing the equivalent of like "I heart Hitler" in his own personal diaries and admiring of Hitler and very fawning over Hitler. Hitler is saying, "What an idiot! What a moron!" He sees Stalin as again a world stage version of a useful idiot that he had opposed in the National Socialist Party. Italy is somewhat successful at first, particularly against the African countries, and its alliance with Germany really allows it to ride the coattails of some of that success. The Italians have a two-front war as well. Unfortunately, they are not as successful, and many of their battles are disastrous, and this leads to an increasingly angry Italian populace. Japan, also super successful at first, very strong innovation. They're the first country to launch a plane from a ship. They even create these submarines, these rather large submarines that are able to surface and launch a small recon airplane, a little recon seaplane that was able to scout out targets. It would land, fold up its wings, go back into the submarine. The submarine would submerge, and they'd be able to take on that target. So it's pretty amazing. And they also had a surprise hit against the United States. The United States largely ignored intelligence that told them that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor. It was believed much, much more likely that Japan would attack something further out, like the Philippines first, instead of Hawaii. Hawaii was way too close to the U.S. mainland. We would catch them in time. Little did they know. Now, Japan made a huge mistake in that their supply lines are stretched thin. The United States had a relatively large manufacturing base, relatively large oil capacity, relatively large population compared to Japan. Japan also had really long distances to resupply, very scattered terrain, very difficult to keep supplied. They acknowledged that and hoped to take the United States out relatively quickly, force the United States to the bargaining table, get the United States to cede territory, in the Pacific to Japan and basically keep the United States out. Unfortunately, of the 1-2 punch, only punch number one actually took off. Punch number two never really landed, largely because the mastermind behind the plan was killed. And so Japan had a good first hit, but never really could follow it up. Very tenacious fight in the Pacific. I don't want to undersell how tough it was to fight Japan island to island, but it was more of a defensive war than an offensive war for Japan. And to make matters worse, their atrocities, especially against the Chinese, the Filipinos, and American prisoners of war or prisoners of war, were really well publicized. I mean, very, very well publicized. Unlike the German atrocities, which were relatively quiet and kept under wraps, the hierarchy, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, knew about the final solution, knew about the Holocaust, knew about ethnic cleansing in Europe, but it really didn't come out until till the latter part of the war. Compare that to the Japanese, and all of their atrocities became very well publicized very quickly. Now, the Allies themselves also made blunders. Soviet Union have kind of touched on this. Stalin sees Hitler as similar and trusts him, and sees the invasion as a betrayal, makes it really slow for the Soviet Union to respond. The Soviet Union's really unprepared for war. They're lacking in clothing, equipment, fuel, technology. Technologically speaking, the Germans are just mopping the floor with the Russians. And by and large, the defensive fighting and the unbelievably brutal Russian winters saved the day for Russia. Um, if Germany had invaded in very early part of spring, they may have had a little bit more territorial gain. They may have forced the government to collapse. They may have been able to hold on some of the major cities of Russia, like St. Petersburg, but or at the time Leningrad and Stalingrad. But the reality was they went in a little late. They went in several months late, and the winters come a lot earlier. They're a lot harsher, and the supply lines were easy to cut. The United Kingdom was also startled by German success. They thought they'd be able to come in and help bolster French army. If anybody saw the film a couple of years ago of Dunkirk, that shows you how fast and how desperate that the uh, that the British military was to get their troops out of there as fast as possible because the Germans were advancing so quickly. The United Kingdom was largely unwilling to go to war until war was forced upon them, and there was some sympathy with fascists. The United Kingdom very quickly has its supply lines cut. The unrestricted submarine warfare and American neutrality prevent food and fuel and parts and you name it from coming to the aid of Britain, and this leads to what is often referred to as the finest hour, the air defense of Britain that proves to be surprisingly tenacious, thanks in no small part to a secret weapon that is radar, initially developed as kind of like a death ray to aim at enemy planes and basically kill people who are piloting them. Turned out that was a flight of fancy, but you could at least see them, you could at least detect them long before they were visibly on the horizon, and this allowed the relatively small, undermanned, underfunded, underarmed um, Royal Air Force to counter effectively the German advance. So, of course, the Blitz, the bombing of London and other cities within the United Kingdom, was also very devastating to the British. Didn't necessarily have to happen. It was largely because of British bombing of German towns that felt like it was repercussions for that. The United States was isolationist, and any attempts at readiness by Franklin Delano Roosevelt the more he called for an expansion of the military, the more he called for the expansion of the Navy, the more that his opponents painted it as an attempt to launch a socialist coup against America and to institute a socialist state in America. And so the belief being that the army was, I don't know, an extension of the will of the president of the United States and wouldn't have its own objections to being told to, you know, subjugate the American people. But go figure. And there was also a little bit of malevolence involved in American unwillingness to get involved in World War II. Part of it was racism. Part of it was a desire to be neutral. And as I mentioned before, the United States really ignored warnings of what was happening. Intelligence report after intelligence report said that Japan was going to attack, that Germany was engaging in anti-American interests abroad, that Italy was targeting American businesses and all this sort of stuff. So there was a lot of warning signs that were largely ignored because of that isolationist idea that the problems were overseas. They weren't here at home. And it wasn't until Pearl Harbor showed that the seas were not a barrier but a highway that the United States gets involved in World War II. Now, all told, the Second World War was far, far, far more devastating uh, for the world than the previous Great War. About 3% of the total world population is killed in between 1939 and 1945. That includes 11 million civilians who were killed in the Holocaust, 6 million of whom are Jews. To put 11 million people in perspective, that would be every man, woman, and child living in the state of Ohio murdered, gone between in the course of 7 years. So imagine that's an immense, or put it even more perspective, almost 3 times the population of Kentucky combined, 3 times. So every man, woman, and child in Kentucky killed 3 times over. 50 to 60 million civilians bear the hugest brunt of this war. And within that 50 to 60 million is the 11 million from the Holocaust because they are non-combatants, because they are civilians. So all told, somewhere between 70 and 85 million people die in World War II. The causes range from genocide and murder, collateral damage, starvation, disease, and weather exposure. Now, there's the shame of Europe, and that is that European countries, citizens, and governments embrace and comply with the Nazi final solution. It is not just Germans who do this. We like to blame the Germans. We say, oh, it's all Hitler. Oh, it's all the Germans. Oh, it's all those. It's other people imposed. No, there were a lot of people in the Netherlands, in France, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Belarus, in Estonia, in Denmark, who complied with these laws, who embraced these ideas, who ratted out people like the Franks who were hiding in an attic in the Netherlands. It wasn't that suddenly Germans moved into the Netherlands and said, "Oh, look, that is a Jew hiding in that attic." No, it was Dutch people who ratted him out. Why did they rat him out? Well, because they began to comply with these immoral laws. 11 million people were murdered in Europe, murdered in the most vicious, dehumanizing way. Many were starved, as we see in the picture here. Many were beaten, gang raped, were stabbed to death, shot to death, drowned, gassed, buried alive. And that includes not just Jews, but Slavic people, gypsies, black people, the developmentally disabled. So if you know somebody who has autism, who is autistic, or has Asperger's syndrome, Asperger's, the term originates in Nazi Germany to determine people who seemed normal on the outside but had certain mental deficiencies. And those people were taken away to camps to be euthanized or to be sterilized, forcibly sterilized. The experimentation was carried out on men, women, and children, including vivisection. Vivisection is taking somebody apart while they're still alive with no anesthetic to see how organs work, to see how nervous systems work, to see how pain works. This is the shame of Europe, and it was not just the Germans. The Germans take the big ticket, but it wasn't just them. There's a shame of Japan as well. The Japanese military commanders give in to the violent desires of those in lower tiers. And the military is given free rein to treat prisoners and civilians as they wish, without regard to the Geneva Conventions that have been established for decades. Things like the Bataan Death March. If you've never heard of it, it is tens of thousands of American soldiers were captured in Bataan in the Philippines and forced to march through the jungle without food, rest, or water. Some died because of exhaustion. Some were killed because of malaria. Some were killed by the Japanese as examples for those who didn't march. And at the end of their march, they didn't receive relief. They were loaded onto ships and kept in sweltering heat, where many more of them died of asphyxiation or died of heat stroke, or were accidentally sunk when American troops were trying to fight the Japanese. The Japanese would use these ships as shields to absorb the torpedo impacts of American ships. They also engaged in forced labor camps. They engaged in torture, human experimentation, and between 3 to 9 million Chinese were massacred. This doesn't even talk about the comfort women, the women who were taken from Chinese and Korean families and raped repeatedly over and over and over and over again. And if they tried to commit suicide, or if they tried to run away, or if they tried to fight back, the threat was that their mother, their grandmother, their aunt, their nephew, their niece, their daughters, their sisters would be taken in their place. So there was horrific atrocities that were happening in Europe as well as in Asia. There's also a lot of shame to go around for America. The United States denied entry of Jews to its borders, even in the face, even with knowledge that the Holocaust was happening. Between 1939 and 1945, sorry, only 200,000 Jews were allowed to emigrate to the United States. Very few of them actually came from Germany. Former President Herbert Hoover said that Jews coming over were likely to be a public charge. They were likely to need American taxpayer dollars, and they were low skilled. They didn't speak English, and they probably would take jobs away that Americans needed. Often Jews were conflated by pundits and politicians alike with Bolshevik agitators. There was this myth that Jews were in charge of the communist coup in Russia. And the reality is Stalin and before him Lenin had really purged Jews from all of the Soviet Union. Being Jewish was as good as a death sentence in many cases. Henry Ford paid to have Mein Kampf imported and printed 250,000 actually, copies of Mein Kampf and distributed to his workers. The radio priest, Father Coughlin, who ostensibly was a Roman Catholic, had called Jews human scum who were right to be wiped out. He would later be defrocked by the Pope, but not until after World War II. 85% of the United States didn't want Jews to come to the United States. They didn't want refugees. They felt that they were dirty, they would bring political instability, that they would take away American jobs. Does this argument seem familiar? People fleeing for their lives, going thousands of miles, taking amazing risks to wind up at America's borders, hoping for sanctuary, hoping for freedom, hoping for assistance, and being turned away because they were criminals or they were dirty or they were uh, revolutionaries or they were murderers or they were rapists or they were drug dealers or they were whatever. The U.S. fear of the other led to Japanese internment camps internally. So it wasn't that we weren't just turning away people externally, but we focused on the Japanese Americans, first, second, and third generation Americans who had been part of the American tapestry for decades, who had been working in America, particularly in the western states, for generations. Executive Order 9066 transferred 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes, forced them to give up their jobs, forced them to give up their possessions. They were only allowed to take 2 suitcases with them to an internment camp, to several internment camps that were held deep inside, some as far as North Dakota. While there, they were strictly regulated. They were only allowed to leave if they were working for a farmer or if they were working on roads that were supervised by a contractor for the United States military. In other words, they weren't paid. They were essentially slave labor in a new form. Of course, the way that this was portrayed was that they were willing to leave the internment camps and show that they were loyal to the United States. But the reality was the internment camps were often poorly serviced with electricity, running water. Things like typhoid, dysentery, and cholera were commonplace in these internment camps, and they were often denied medical access unless a camp-wide outbreak occurred. Canada also did the same, so it's not just the United States. Canada also deported using the same methodology. Now, the difference between the two, though, is in the United States in the 1980s, and a formal apology was made and reparations were made to the Japanese internment. Nothing similar has happened in much more now liberal Canada. But the reality was there was fear of the Japanese Americans or the Japanese Canadians, but not so much fear of Germans or Italians on the opposite end of the country. Question begs, why? Well, the easy answer is it was easier to tell a Japanese American from a German American or an Italian American. Also, Japanese Americans were historically the other. Remember those the proposal before the League of Nations in the previous lecture where we talked about all people should be treated equally regardless of nationality or creed? Well, that was a response to some of the anti-Japanese, anti-Chinese laws that were present in places like California, Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, Oregon. The war does end, and it ends largely with the death of two of the heads of the fascist states. Um, Benito Mussolini is actually killed by communist Italians, and he is hung upside down. It is a traditional hanging. His body is hung upside down, traditional hanging for a thief and for people who are particularly hated and heinous, like murderers. Hitler kills himself before the Russians are able to take Berlin. And eventually the war does end in the Pacific. It ends because the United States had to make a horrible decision. There were 2 weapons that were developed during the Second World War, or there was a weapon developed called atomic weaponry, and 2 versions of it were deployed over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Hiroshima bomb, nicknamed Fat Man because it was a big, round, kind of spherical bomb, and then Little Boy was a cylindrical looking bomb, were the first and only, thank God, use of atomic weaponry in warfare. It not only devastated the entire towns, as you can see here, only a few buildings survive, but it also inflicted untold suffering and untold lingering destruction that had never been really experienced before. Unfortunately, I did say that this is a terrible decision, and I don't think that the United States entered into this lightly. Um, there was the belief that the United States, if it had to invade the four islands that make up Japan, would pay an incredibly heavy price. In preparation for landing in Japan, because that was the final prize, in preparation for landing in Japan, the United States ordered millions of Purple Hearts. Millions. Those Purple Hearts were made. In fact, they're still being given out today. No new Purple Hearts have been made since 1945. So there was going to be a horrific island to island, foot by foot, yard by yard fight to cause Japan to surrender. And so it was believed expedient to drop these atomic weaponry on the cities to show the destructive capability of the United States and to force the Japanese to surrender. The horrors were unbearable. The radiation burns. Those who were lucky died in the initial blasts, often vaporized, leaving only a shadow behind to show that they were there one moment and gone the next. The rest had to deal with horrific scars, cancers, deformities, and deprivation on a scale that is unimaginable today. The United States has commemorated the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for every presidential visit to Japan since 1950 up until 2016. And the United States offered apologies and condolences to the people of Japan. But it was an expediency. It is a hotly debated topic as to whether the United States could have won without a massive invasion, could have won without dropping these atomic bombs, but again, that's ahistorical and that's speculation. I believe in my heart of hearts that it was a tough decision, that it was a decision that haunted not just the people of Japan, but the people of America as well, especially those who were part of the air crews, like the Enola Gay, that saw the destruction firsthand. After World War II, the world is a radically different place. The United States is producing one in every two products created in the world. The United States is 50% of the manufactured goods and food for the entire world. A necessary end of the war led to a necessary end of the Lend-Lease program. This creates resentment with the Soviet Union, who fears that the United States is about to pivot and invade the Soviet Union and collapse its Bolshevik revolution. Joseph Stalin, having been betrayed by somebody he felt he trusted, had become even more paranoid than he had before. The United Kingdom receives Lend-Lease for a few years after, but it too ends, and eventually there is a problem in Europe. Europe and Japan are devastated, impoverished, and starving. There's no productive capacity. There's no real infrastructure. There's no real food getting to the people. So Europe and Asia are devastated and ruined. What elements in the 1920s and 1930s led to the rise of fascism and totalitarianism? If you look back on your notes and you see income inequality, political instability, propaganda and lies, oppression of the working class, and so on, you're absolutely right. And that's absolutely what's happening after World War II. There's rampant income inequality. People can't even put food on their table. They can't find work. How then can the world ensure that another, even more devastating World War III wasn't just 10 or 20 years on the horizon? Well, one of the ways the United States came up with addressing this was to tackle the underlying causes of that uncertainty, to enforce pacifism, and to rebuild Europe. It doesn't seem fair, but the US does lead the rebuilding effort in Europe and in Japan, largely through taxpayer dollars. American taxpayers do pay for money to be loaned to European governments of both sides. All belligerents were eligible. The Soviet Union was actually offered money to help rebuild part of its devastated countryside, but it turned that money down, seeing it as a trap. Now, that money was not free; it was loans, and the idea was, of course, that this money would be given to these governments. The governments, of course, would turn to the United States and purchase from the United States. By purchasing from the United States, you keep wartime production relatively high so that all those soldiers coming back from the war would have jobs waiting for them when they come back. The so-called MacArthur Plan is a mirror image of the Marshall Plan that re-energizes Europe. The US plays a huge role in rewriting the constitutions of Germany and Japan. In Japan, Japan's constitution becomes a very pacifist, implicitly pacifist country. Its constitution forbids the creation of a military. It can have a self-defense force, but it doesn't have an aggressive, outward-looking military. Germany doesn't quite have that kind of restriction, largely because the Soviet Union's most populous cities are closer to it than it is to Japan, but it is limited. It has a cap on how much it can expand its military. It does, however, begin to ensure workers' rights. Europe implements this New Deal-like economic measures. They begin to emulate the United States' lead. They go a little bit further even. For example, the United Kingdom, France, Germany all institute universal health care. They all institute very generous unemployment insurance. And depending on the country, less so with the United Kingdom, more so in places like France, the Netherlands, Denmark, others, you see the rise of cheap or even free childcare, the rise of free higher education, first at high school, then later on in colleges. The U.S. leads the formation of new international bodies to regulate international interaction. The United States takes the lead in forming the United Nations, forming the World Court, the War Crimes Trials, as well as U.S.-led alliances like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United Nations is a U.S.-led deliberative body that is intended to enforce international norms and prevent the recurrence of another war like this due to belligerent powers. The idea is that if any one country becomes super belligerent, that the United States could lead other nations into a international coalition to isolate them, to basically prevent them from expanding too much, to basically punish them. The International Court holds the powerful accountable so that even leaders of countries, had they been captured, would have been put on trial. In 1949, the United States takes the lead in helping rewrite the Geneva Convention to include war crimes. No longer is following orders an excuse to commit atrocities. So if you are ordered to, say, kill a bunch of prisoners of war, your nation's laws may say you have to follow that order, but international law says by following that order, you are as guilty as the person who gave the order. Back at home, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as he saw the war winding down, he unfortunately dies before the end of the war. He lays plans to ensure that the United States would enjoy prosperity and continued progress and continued freedom. He articulated the need to continue expanding the New Deal to include economic rights and an economic bill of rights, that we have a political bill of rights, but not an economic one. There needed to be a safety net for the working and middle class people, including universal health care. He proposed the GI Bill, where returning veterans would receive free college educations Or if they were not interested in a college education, they would receive 1 year of unemployment to be able to sustain their family. Absolutely free. They didn't have to do anything beyond that. If they were looking to start a business, they had this money set aside so that they could start that business. That second Bill of Rights never really went through. The idea of universal access to healthcare, or the universal right to housing, or the universal right to a good standard of living, not a minimum wage, but a living wage, was shot down by opposition within the American Congress. And so it never really saw the light of day. So, why did European countries ensure domestic programs to help the poor and impoverished? Why do you think that FDR proposed similar programs for the United States? And why did you think that the US opposition did not support those kinds of programs? Do you think that maybe FDR's popularity, the fact that he was elected to 4 consecutive terms, has anything to do with it? So essentially, as we wrap up, fascism preyed on uncertainty and fear. Simple answers wrought horrific behavior. The world was devastated by violence, war, and genocide, and there was a need to safeguard against that happening again. The United States becomes one of two world leaders, a so-called superpower, whose ability to wage war outstripped any other nation. The devastation of World War II exacerbated uncertainty, and there was a need for socialistic policies to one degree or another. The Soviet Union, especially Joseph Stalin, became increasingly paranoid about invasion, worried that perhaps this invasion by Germany was just one of many false olive branches, these false accolades of friendship. Could trust nobody, believe nobody. Exacerbating this was the end of the Lend-Lease program for the Soviet Union while it continued for England. It seemed like maybe the US and England were conspiring to invade Russia, even though at the time both countries were super exhausted. There was no way that the United States and the United Kingdom, even if they had the desire, had the wherewithal to prosecute that war. Also, the rebuilding of Europe, particularly the rebuilding of Germany and its productive capacity, even in a limited amount, alarmed the Soviet Union. It saw potentially another war on the horizon. So the Soviet Union, this Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, becomes another world leader and becomes another superpower, focusing solely, at least initially, on the rebuilding of its military and in expanding its influence around the world. All right, guys, that is it for this week. We've had a lot to cover. We've had a lot of things to think about. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you again next week. Stay safe.